Eve Sanders. No, we've just had our message about the meeting being recorded. I'd like to go through a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So as I was saying, Eve Saunders, our project officer for Estuary Edges, and she's got her email, and she's going to be giving that email through the presentation. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our panelists. First of all, this webinar is going to be about an hour and a half long, and it is being recorded, as you've just been alerted to. And we're going to have handle the Q&A session for those of you who are used to either Zoom or Microsoft Teams. This is Zoom, obviously. And when you want to ask questions, please do so using the Q&A function. Eve is going to be able to send you information via the chat, but you won't be able to send information back on the chat. We're going to have, Amy's going to help me curate some questions, and if for whatever reason, so we're going to have, you can ask for questions that may be answered through the webinar presentation. At the end, we're going to have a live Q&A. And if for whatever reason your questions get answered, we will be able to email you because we've got your details. And so the other things we need to remind you of is that we will be posting this online as quickly as we can. Please give Eve about a week to be able to get it up and running, so you'll have a record of that. So we had a really great last session. We had lots of broad questions around the 25-year environment plan, anyway, to complex questions around planning applications and planning guidance around building and estuary edges, all the way to the kind of timber that's being used on them. So here we want to be able to utilize our feedback from our speakers on technical guidance and the design and development of estuary edges. So Eve, if you can go to the next slide. So in order from the top, moving from left to right, we have our speakers, Dave Webb, who's from the Environment Agency. Dave is a Fisheries, Biodiversity, and Geomorphology team leader based at the EA, and he has over 20 years of experience. Dave's presentation will be focusing on green infrastructure and sustainable urban drainage systems, SuDS, around London using the Royal Wharf as a case study. We've got Dr. Richard Charman, also from the Environment Agency. Richard is a geomorphology technical specialist, and he works in the Fisheries, Biodiversity, and Geomorphology team and has a specialism in estuary sediment movements. And he's also worked in flood risk. Richard's presentation is going to be on litter levels, light, and littoral sediment, and it covers the technical and challenging aspects of creating a terrace in an urban estuary. We've got David Allsop from the Port of London Authority. David is the Assistant Harbour Master, and he has many years of experience working on the water, and will be focusing his talk today on the safety and navigation aspects of implementing estuary edges sites. So the Port of London Authority is responsible for the safety of navigation on the tidal Thames and works to promote water safety for everybody on or near the Thames. So this section is going to cover those design features intended to ensure the construction does not interfere with safe navigation, to reduce the potential for harm, and to promote rescue and recovery of persons from the water. And then next we've got Morgan Harrington from the Environment Agency and Rachel Holmes, also from the Environment Agency. They're both from Sustainable Places teams, and they're experienced Sustainable Places planning advisors based in the Environment Agency Sustainable Places team. And their talk's going to focus on achieving the gold standard for Flint Glass Wharf and how they secured environmental gains through the planning process. They will also be mentioning best practices for the planning process. So each of the talks from our panel are going to last around 14 minutes. And as I said, you can ask questions either through typing them in the Q&A section, or we will try to catch those written Q&A at the end where we'll have a live discussion. And then we will close. So I'd like to be able to hand over to our first speaker now, who's Dave Webb from the Environment Agency.
Thank you very much, Heather. And so I'm going to an overview, so there'll be slightly less of the technical detail in this presentation, but I will be giving, say, an overview on green infrastructure and integrated design, with particular focus on linking inward green infrastructure to the estuary edges measure, and then have a particular focus on sustainable urban drainage. Can I have the next slide, please? So green infrastructure is an overarching term for a number of discrete elements, such as parks, street trees, green roofs, rivers and streams, that go to make a functional network of green and blue spaces across London. These are important in their own right, such as habitats and parks for recreation, and features of landscape and cultural heritage. However, by considering their design and management together, they can deliver benefits that are greater than the sum of their parts through either delivering multiple benefits on specific projects or linking to larger land-scale initiatives to provide wider in-combination benefits. Can I have the next slide, please? So within London, the All London Green Grid is the policy framework to promote the design and delivery of green infrastructure for the benefit of people and wildlife. This includes blue spaces such as the Thames and other rivers and canals and ponds, and that it's planned to provide a range of benefits, including recreation and amenity, contributing to climate change and adaptation, improving water quality, flood mitigation and reduced flood risk through specifically sustainable urban drainage systems, providing a greater appreciation of the landscape and cultural heritage and protection and enhancement of biodiversity, including biodiversity within new developments, and increasing recreational opportunities and access and the enjoyment of open and blue space for the public. Can I have the next slide, please? Integral to delivering green infrastructure, a successful green infrastructure project, is the delivery of those multiple benefits. And this can be improved through the partnership working. This may appear daunting when considering single sites. However, the framework of the catchment partnerships can provide support to do this, facilitating work across disciplines and recognising the interdependency between environmental, social and economic processes within and outside the catchments, and also identifying cost-effective solutions which deliver multiple benefits through often restoring natural processes and identifying unintentional consequences of actions. And very much Estuary Edges is part of that work to identify those innovative integrated solutions. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so to deliver integrated green infrastructure, site characterisation is needed to provide both a spatial, geographical and functional context. Geographical analysis simply relates to the proximity of features and initiatives. This, for instance, may include opportunity areas for habitat creation or setback defences, and enables the site to be put into context both in terms of programme and projects, which will assist in the scoping out of both opportunities and risks for the development. Next slide, please. On a similar vein, mapping can also provide an understanding of function. This could be, for instance, ecological functions such as the migration of species, such as eels, or wider functions such as improved amenity and flood risk. And so we can see how this can actually deliver both within a site, but also link into those wider catchment scale initiatives. And so where often it may appear that a single intervention may appear to be quite small functionally, it actually can be put into context with a much wider range of delivery through a catchment scale project. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the geographical information, obviously looking initially at constraints, some of the issues for the tidal Thames has been encroachment, which is losing, which results in the loss of intertidal habitat, which obviously is loss of habitat in its own right, but can also impact on the migration of particularly fish species. It also can potentially risk is the loss of green and open space next to the river, but also the loss of brownfield habitat, which often has a unique assemblage of invertebrates and birds. Also, there is potential for the loss of ecological features associated with the river walls. Quite often, as a wall becomes more derelict, actually its ecological value increases, and quite often this is the challenge that we have in terms of ensuring that a new river defence is fit for purpose for that, but maintaining that and improving that ecological value. And others, which I think Richard will say a little bit, overshading and lighting can also be big issues in terms of having successful green infrastructure next to the Thames. Next slide, please. However, on a much more positive note, the Thames provides a unique opportunity to deliver a whole range of benefits, which makes it which can potentially lead to developments really being of a high standard. And so obviously we have the Thames Path, and that obviously is both a large linear feature going across the river, but also links into a much wider network of projects that go street walks that go in London as well. The foreshore, as mentioned, is a unique resource both for ecology but also for access and education, and is of immense historical and cultural value. And of course, there are also a range of other assets and features often associated with the river, such as drawdocks, slipways. These can be re-energized, but in some other instances, some old structures can be redesigned to create new features, for instance, of ecological value, as we can see with the O2. Can I have the next slide, please? Brilliant. So in terms of kind of good and bad practice, as it were, so this is work which was done actually as part of the designs. Then we have this narrowing of a river path and space next to the Thames, creating a corridor effect, building barriers and potentially creating very inhospitable environments through the development of wind tunnels, and clearly is a massive missed opportunity. Next slide, please. On the other hand, and this is very much the concepts taken forward through the O2, the Greenwich Peninsula, and that is the creation of setback defences, sustainable defences, where footpaths are integrated through the defence system, ecological habitats created, maximising, improving that experience of being next to the river and creating this world-class development. So yes, next slide, please. So just moving in onto the sustainable development and sustainable drainage. clearly there is a great benefit in terms of integrating the design to enable sustainable urban drainage to meet a range of environmental challenges, from its original purpose of controlling water quantity to actually contributing to improving water quality, as well as in creating new landscape and amenity features. Next slide, please. And so as part of this, there is now a whole range, a massive palette of different options, from swales to porous surfaces. And in this instance, an innovative solution is with brown roofs. And with this, the use of particularly some of the kind of wasteland rubble, which was associated with much of the Thames, actually has provided a very good system for both retaining water, but has also helped provide or replace that brownfield habitat, which was very much a character of the Thames, and as I said, very much important for a range of Thames terrace invertebrates, but also a species, a rare species in the UK, but one which is more common in London, was the black redstart. And the slides here is a picture of Deptford Creek, in the area of Deptford Creek, which is one of the hot spots for brown roofs. So next slide, please. So one of the important things as well alluded to is that of particularly controlling storm runoff and first flush. And though often these might seem quite small, again, each site can contribute to that bigger picture of helping retain or can improve that water going into the system. So next slide, please. So going into final amount of detail, we look at the Royal Wharf, where we've got the landward green infrastructure, which is a series of parks and swales, which we can see if you look at the three slides from left to right, finally going into the intertidal terrace, which is the last slide. So you're actually having a situation where you've got that runoff, which is controlled, also creating habitat, but also delivering that water quality improvement. And what's particularly important with this one is that actually it runs through into or connecting the runoff into the terraces. And here we have a slide, a bird's view slide of two engineered terraces, one with an outfall, which is the one on the left, and one without on the right. The one with an outfall will have some similarities to a small estuary due to the input of fresh water at one end, which combats the incoming tide and deposits fine sediment on that tide. It will immediately form a creek and may have gravelled riffles if that outfall is frequently used. This will be a habitat type present, which will not be present in the deep engineered terrace without an outfall. Final slide, please. With time, and if the engineered terrace is very deep, continued sediment deposition will lead to habitat succession, and what we will get, this will occur rapidly in the engineered terrace without an outfall, because the tidal input of sediments is never washed away, but the output of fresh washed away by the output of the fresh water. Although a small creek is likely to develop with time within a small terrace without an outfall, it is likely to disappear. So it's very important to maintain that flow to enable that outfall, that creek feature, to be sustained in the long term. Okay, thank you. I think I just managed to do me time. And that's it.
Thank you, Dave. I really appreciate that. That was really interesting, and particularly your comments about making the small interventions in terms of connectivity and how that can help habitat. And I think we'd like to hear more about that in full course. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Charman. Richard, if you want to load up your slides.
Indeed, and unmuting. Right, hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, thanks. Hopefully everyone, fingers up from everyone, I think that's okay. So originally I was going to choose a slightly more boring title for this, on how to create a perfect terrace, which effectively is what this is. As a geomorphologist, the sediment element of this and also the levels is probably the most significant to my daily work. But in many ways, litter can be treated as a sediment type as well, the way it's washed into an estuary edge. So those three elements are very much my daily work, and light influences vegetation. So for anyone who's actually looked at the Estuary Edges website to date, and I would highly recommend it, it's set up with a series of design principles, 17 design principles that if you follow, then you should be able to design and build a good estuary edge feature, as we've called them. And within that, 3, 5, and 10 cover these elements of litter, sediment, light, and levels. So design principle number 3, I won't read the whole text, but the end of it focuses on ensuring that the zone that you're building is going to be between mean high water neaps and mean high water spring tidal levels. And I've got some drawings that will explain and demonstrate that in a moment. Consider master planning early on in the design of your site. So that very much overlaps with what Dave was just talking about. So ensuring that freshwater drainage, suds and swales goes through at outfalls and into your estuary edge feature is something we have very few examples at still, but we know that it would work. We know that it would work best for the biodiversity of the estuary. And number 10, I think we must have got less adventurous when we got lower down on the list of the design principles, and we said design it for litter and geomorphology. You have to click on those to find out a little bit more information. So I'm going to go into those elements in detail over the next 13 minutes or 12 minutes now. Firstly, getting levels correct. Now, this is actually surprisingly difficult to do if you don't have a local tide gauge, and levels vary throughout estuaries as well, so you can't assume that the level at the mouth of the estuary will be the same inland. So some form of logging of a device or getting in touch with the local port authority to know exactly what these levels would be is important. Now, what we're missing predominantly in urban estuaries, so such as the Thames, is the vegetated area. Now, I've tried to show, so in a natural estuary, at the bottom left-hand corner photograph would show the transition from mudflats through to different zones of salt marsh and then up into more terrestrial vegetation. And effectively what we're trying to do is compress that with an estuary edge feature, as you see on the bottom right-hand photograph, which is, I think, Saxon Wharf in Deptford Creek. And I've tried to show that in cross-section above that with the low tide blue water and then going across the mudflat up through the different zones with the salt marsh creek and up into the terrestrial. And the zone that vegetates and the one that we're missing in urban estuaries is between your mean high water springs, so the top line, and the mean low water neaps, which is the second to bottom line. Reducing litter trapping. So we learned a bit about this with the review and the relaunch of Estuary Edges 3 years ago now. By all means, they're still hypotheses in a way, and I think they still need testing with research. So if there's anyone from any universities on the line, this would be really useful for us to know more about. We believe that changing the orientation of the mouth of the creek. So in my last presentation, I went into the 3 designs terrace, which was naturalized setback via creeks, terraces, which are more engineered, and timber bolt-ons. So if we're going for the most natural form, you can change the mouth of that, and the direction would potentially prevent litter from being washed in. So generally the prevailing wind, we believe, is what is washing litter into these features. The bottom left photographs show the River Roding over to the east end of London, and the green areas are, so the creek is very easy to discern in the top photograph. The bottom photograph, the creek is less easy to discern, but it follows the lush green reeds in a kind of tick shape. Both of them are similar shapes. The northern one of those, and indeed that is further up that creek and is further north, doesn't face into the prevailing wind, and you can see from the photograph that there's no litter in it. The bottom one faces into the prevailing wind. I've tried to show that with the blue arrow, and is absolutely chock-a-block with litter. We also believe that frequent groins helps trap litter, as demonstrated by the site on the right-hand side of your screen, where there's that's on the Limo Peninsula on Bow Creek, where there's so much litter that it's a wonder that the vegetation actually manages to go through. So that's we derived that guidance from those sites. Further to that, we believe that tall plants, such as Phragmites, is particularly good at trapping litter. Variation of plant type, as shown at Battersea Wharf in the bottom right, with different levels of plants, would reduce the amount of litter trapping. And we know that the one site where a boom has been used, which is also at Battersea Wharf in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, the booms actually prevent fish passage, at least fish from exiting the site. And they tend to break. They have sliders and they run up and down with the tide. And we don't know any good examples where they've actually been successful to date. So it's led us to the advice that they should only be used if absolutely necessary. Ensuring enough light. So this aerial photograph on the right of your screen actually isn't in the Thames, it's on the Medway, but you can see that it was taken late in the day, or maybe on a summer's evening, and you can see the length of those shadows from those tower blocks across the mudflat and out onto the water. Now, I can't guarantee that that photograph was taken at extreme low tide, so there may be more mudflat there. And therefore, you know that if you're on the south side of an estuary with a north-facing development, actually those terraces probably won't get a great deal of light, and they may not be entirely successful in their vegetated nature. We were presented with the car park with the derelict barge that you see in that photograph, and our advice was to put the terrace on the western side of that built-out area, so that it will get the evening sunshine, and to actually avoid the north side of that site. So if you've got the luxury of having multiple sides of a development, then we would recommend that the north side is actually avoided, and that there's a concentration of terraces built on the east or the west sides. Also, in the Medway, now this is something that I would like to achieve in London, and we haven't yet managed to. The construction of a large, long creek, which has that succession of salt marsh, mudflat through to different salt marsh zones that I showed you in the earlier photograph. That was achieved here on the Medway. And you can see, and recently I went there with Dave.webb, and we spoke about it. Now we know that creek will probably vegetate and fill in quite quickly because there's limited freshwater drainage. So a missing trick with that creek, it is amazing, but it doesn't have the outfall going through it. And that's particularly relevant if your site is north facing as well, because it will have it will get rid of that problem. The depth of your terrace. Now, with some of the infrastructure, and there may be pipes, tube tunnels, outfalls as we already discussed, coming to the river's edge, may present problems for the depth that a terrace can be designed at. But we found from experience that 1 meter depth seems to be successful, and if it's less than 1 meter, then there's a higher risk of either the terrace not responding in the same way as a natural mudflat, or wave energy washing out the sediment. And so in the worst case, you're seeing one end of one of the sites on the Greenwich Peninsula where the washout has happened to the lower terrace. And you can see that really isn't a great depth of sediment. Equally, drainage holes, so that the mud and the gravel in that location doesn't become waterlogged, is important as well. There's a cross section of a site. The site doesn't matter in the middle of your screen, and that we think that fill was too shallow in that location. And the photograph on the left is supposed to show waterlogging. So a lot of the terraces that we look at, we're creating to a specific elevation, but if you get it slightly wrong, it shouldn't matter, because ideally it will accrete with sediment. Now, in a muddy estuary such as the Thames, you've got a vast amount of sediment to fix that problem, and providing it's not going to get washed out by waves and it's in a quiet enough location, it will accrete to a certain elevation behind that engineered feature if necessary. In some estuaries, such as down in the southwest in Devon, where the water, the difference of colour is notable, there is actually much less sediment in suspension in the first place. So the accretion rates and the success of your feature, which may be down to the level not being got quite right, or maybe the light not being got quite right, would be exacerbated and fixed slower in an estuary where there's less sediment. Now, if we say that there's plenty of sediment, the remaining elements from a geomorphological perspective that would that could dictate your success of your terrace maybe waves. Now, that's particularly a problem if you've got increasing vessel traffic, increasing different styles of vessels. And also with wind direction, if you've got a large fetch, then you may have wind waves. So wind waves and vessel waves, perfect storm. And the area that you're seeing in red demonstrated on a section of the Thames would probably not succeed very well for having a terrace. Knowing about vessel direction and which side of the estuary they're travelling, where your terrace is likely to have the most wave wash up from vessels, will also help with your design. Furthermore, thinking about currents and also thinking about where previous encroachment has occurred. So the construction outwards into the channel and the narrowing of the channel is known as encroachment. I know that Dave spoke about that earlier. And the likelihood is that the currents on a terrace further out into the channel are going to be higher. So avoiding areas that are encroached. And equally, the outside of a meander bend, on your inside of your meander bend, you tend to get depositional features. On the outside, you tend to get scour and erosion, because your currents are going to be more turbulent on the outside. So thinking about all of these features to work out where your terrace should be and what design that terrace should be, what challenges does it have, will help in a successful feature. So ways to mitigate. So don't abandon all hope. I don't want to give the impression from the last 3 slides that it is impossible in those locations, because it is. It is possible to build something that will work. Now, a steep terrace will have less chance of success, more likelihood of sediment being washed out, more likelihood of vegetation not taking hold. We think 1 in 7 is about the terrace that will work in a low energy environment. 1 in 10 will work in a higher energy environment, and if you get too steep, to say a 1 in 4, that won't work in any environment. Now, we believe Battersea Wharf, which was the one where I showed you the boom earlier, was steeper than the 1 in 7, and is one of the reasons that sediment hasn't accreted. So the message is shallower slopes are going to be more stable. Equally, if you've got a narrow terrace from front to back, with a very hard tall wall at the back, you're likely to get wave reflection, be that wind or vessel generated, which will cause scour. And the bottom 2 left photographs show the same site. That's Royal Wharf that Dave spoke about, with the deep luxuriant vegetation growing where the outfall has been located with the SuDS. And then along the rest of the site, there's this really narrow, almost less than 1 meter terrace, which really hasn't succeeded well. Now, we think that's because it's too shallow in its fill. So the cross section I showed you earlier was that design, and also the depth is too shallow for the amount of wave energy in that section of the estuary. So that site has great successes with the deep terraces, but less success along those narrow further terraces. Further ways to mitigate. So I hinted at groins earlier being bad for litter, but they have a purpose, and they would help to slow currents, particularly on the outside of meander bends. And that was done at Battersea Wharf, and I think they probably have been. So the bottom left-hand photograph is Battersea Wharf. I think they have worked quite well. They've also worked quite well at Point Wharf, which is near the Millennium Dome in the east of London, which is your right-hand photograph. However, you've got to think about the wave direction and whether there's a lot of litter that might get trapped in those groin bays. I think Battersea Wharf, the groin levels are quite low, which may have helped. It's easy to build in boxes. It's clearly easy to build sheet steel piles and concrete walls in boxes, but if that forms a corner, a sharp corner in the direction that wave energy will approach, then that is going to be a problem for exacerbating that wave energy through reflection. And we've yet to work with a developer to build a site where they've worked with curves. Our planning specialists will talk about a site at Flintglass Wharf where there is curves. It's yet to be built, but we have that potential success still forthcoming. Further ways to mitigate. So if you read estuaryedges.co.uk, you'll see it like a broken record. It keeps saying, don't plant your site unless absolutely necessary. Now, as a developer, most people want it to be green straight away, and so that's very rare that we've managed to achieve that. The reason being that it's nice not to have a monoculture, and it's nice to get the vegetation that would naturally be there in the first place. However, if wave energy or currents are an issue, pre-planting, planting up ready can help, as shown by both of the sites on your screen. So the bottom left is the mouth of the Wandle in the west of London, and the new site, which isn't yet on our website, and that picture's courtesy of Salix, is Riverside Gardens at Greenwich, where you can see rock rolls interspersed with pre-planted Hoya sausages with Phragmites on them. Those rock rolls could also be loose riprap. They don't necessarily have to be in bags, and they probably need to be at the rear and at the front of the terrace mainly. So I think I'm about right, time-wise. If all fails, and I know that Heather's just popped up on my screen, which probably means I'm going over time. If none of that is possible, there is still value in having a cobble or gravel terrace. So creation of what you see on the screen in an engineered form would have value for invertebrates within an estuary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. That was really brilliant. And Richard's mentioned a few times in his presentation to look at the Estuary Edges guidance and look at the principles. And so I'd encourage you to do the same. And then also that a lot of expertise is needed to look at the sites. And so plan early and have a look and see what the principles are when you do your master planning, particularly. So I'm going to hand over to David Allsop from the Port of London Authority. And David, if you could load up your slides, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I will get my slides shared now. I assume that's now sharing and you can all see that, I hope. Right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Allsop, Assistant Harbour Master at the Port of London Authority, and I'm today presenting on the features and design considerations in the interests of safety and navigation when implementing an Estuary Edges site. Introduce the Port of London Authority. I'm sure many of you are well aware, but if not, just a potted rundown of who we are, what we do. The PLA is the Statutory Harbour Authority. Our main piece of legislation is the Port of London Act 1968, which has been amended several times since then. The Port of London Act gives us various duties and powers in the interests of conserving, maintaining and improving the Thames, which is our sort of central purpose and reason for being. We're responsible for approximately 95 miles of the tidal Thames from Teddington Lock, or effectively just below Teddington Lock in the west, all the way out to our outer limits, which are out well out into the estuary and essentially the North Sea. That's a total area of about 600 square miles, over which we are responsible for managing the safe movement of shipping, as well as the conservation and the improvement of the tidal Thames, and that our jurisdiction extends to mean high water on the Thames and to all tidal creeks adjoining the Thames within our overall limits. So very large area we're responsible for. And you can imagine as an organization, we do various teams and departments to stay on top of all our different responsibilities. My own role as Assistant Harbour Master is very much dealing with the shipping side of it, the boats, ships, cargo, pilotage, and so on. And this is more a question of perspective. When you think of the Thames, most people, the first thing that comes into my mind is a 400-meter cargo ship being turned around in the river by 4 tugboats and stuck alongside a jetty. But other people, when you say the Thames, they think of or boating or rowing on the Thames somewhere. They think of the nature and the wildlife and how idyllic it is, especially when you get up, say, further west and upriver on the Thames. And I think it is a question of perspective. What is when you think of the Thames, and what considerations come into your mind? So I'm very much looking at the commercial shipping end of it. The Port of London is now the largest port in the UK. We took that off I believe it was the Humber, which is just behind us in the last tally of cargo figures. We're looking at somewhere, I think it's the mid 40 million tons of cargo mark that come in and out. We welcomed what I believe is still the world's largest ship, called at the Port of London last year. She was 400 meters long, just 399 point something or other. She was brought in and berthed at London Gateway in Essex. So it is also the busiest inland waterway in the UK, not just our passenger boats, tourist boats. I'm sure many of you have been on in central London, down to commercial tug and barge operators and moving, instead of moving things by road, especially things like bulk aggregates and products like that, they're moved by barge and towed up and down the river, which is also a very good way of bringing in building materials and so on for riverside developments, or removing spoil from, say, the Thames Tideway Tunnel developments. So it's a very busy river, and whenever we are looking at building or constructing or changing anything about the foreshore, particularly such as building one of these estuary edges features, it has to be borne in mind that that needs to be balanced against the needs and requirements of the Thames community for cargo and shipping operations. And our core mission, especially in my team, is going to be the safety of navigation, keeping it a safe place for boats and ships and so on to use, and balancing their interests against the interests of conservation and environmental protection, or conserving nature and so on in the Thames. And it is just a balancing act. As part of that, 3 little words: river works licensing. Under the Port of London Act, you will need a license to construct or in place any works or thing in the Thames, which is, as I said, mean high water being the limit of our jurisdiction. So if you're building or constructing anything on the foreshore, you will need a river works license from the Port of London Authority. As I said, 3 little words. It's an enormous amount of work for us in making sure that we assess applications properly. And obviously, once something has been built and done, it's quite difficult to undo it. So it's far better to get it right the first time. So it is a bit of a process applying for a riverworks license. I'll not delve into the intricacies of that, but it will come up a few more times that when we issue a license, we can put conditions on that. And that's our main, one of our main mechanisms of balancing interests whenever we are planning and involved with the development of works on the Thames. Can it go ahead? And sometimes no, but can it go ahead with some conditions and tweaking? And if necessary, they are legally enforceable and so on. And we do have a team that keeps track of riverworks licensing and ensures people are operating within their licenses, because obviously those license conditions were crafted for the overall success of this balancing act of different competing interests on the tidal Thames. Again, back to safety navigation. If you're building or constructing anything, one of our big concerns there is it will impact on navigation on the authorised channel in the river where we expect the majority of boats to be navigating. And that's always, it's very unlikely we're going to approve any form of riverworks construction, estuary edges site or so on, which would in some way impinge on safe navigation. But that's not to say things can't be put and constructed in the Thames, provided there is still enough room for some of the larger commercial boats and ships and so on to get past that. But that is going to be one of our main considerations. So I'll just move on. Apart from the safety of navigation, our other major concern is going to be water safety. Unfortunately, the Thames does see its fair share of people who enter the water get into difficulties, and unfortunately a number of those people do not survive every year. We have issues where the Thames is as quite a significant tidal range. When the tide flows, there's a powerful tidal stream, and of course people actually live in close proximity to it. Whether they're on top of it, they go for days out on the river, by the river. We have bridges over the river. There's access to the foreshore. People like to walk on it and so on. So we have this perfect storm of it being a powerful, deep river, which people very frequently access and live and work alongside. It is a hazardous place, and as such, the PLA, we are concerned about that, and we're working with other partners in the interest of improving water safety. Look at some numbers here, and this might take this. First of all, you can see these figures came out in 2019, so they're not the most recent, and they look at incidents in the river. Just to explain, the blue bars came to notice means a report was made. That could be a witness saw someone in the river who appeared to be in difficulty. It could be a person who is in a crisis and phones 999 and indicates that they intend to enter the river. So we have a lot of reports. Some of them, of course, are false alarms with good intent. Some of them are hoaxes and so on. But what we should look at there is the number of people who actually end up in the water. And this is obviously people in the water who come to our notice that we become aware of. And unfortunately, the number of those people who do not survive entering the Thames. What is unfortunate here is how steady those numbers are. 2015, 2018, we're still looking 30 to 40 every year. People lose their lives in the river, and we'd like to see those numbers come down. Our main application of this is the Tidal Thames Water Safety Forum, which brings together the Blue Light Emergency Services, the Port of London Authority, and other interested agencies and partners to try and develop common strategies and collaborate on methods of reducing the loss of life and persons entering the river. Our main focus here is number one, stopping people entering the river, and number two, if someone has entered the river, how are they going to be rescued and recovered and given aid? And it's planning in advance how to say stop people entering the water, and if they do, what are we going to do about it, or how is it going to be dealt with? So that's where this comes into your design features when trying to implement an Estuary Edges feature or installation. The guidance does say the number of features that are suggested to be considered. So we'll go through some of these. These are the type of features that are likely to be part of your planning when you're considering how do I stop people entering the river? How do I promote their rescue and recovery should they enter the river? All of these are quite obvious, and I'm sure you're already well aware of them. Signage, fencing and railings, keeping people away from the river's edge and making sure they're warned that the river is deep, there are currents flowing, and it is not suitable for people to swim, bathe, paddle or wade, and they're warned about that and kept away from it. One of the interesting things that other options that could exist to dissuade people, I've heard of, I think it was a cliff edge where it had a spate of people falling from the cliff or jumping from the cliff edge, and the body responsible for that, instead of building an enormous fence all the way around this cliff edge, they deliberately cultivated very thorny bushes all the way around the cliff, which dissuaded people, especially children, from playing too close to the edge. And so there's sometimes quite novel things we can do to nudge people in the right direction without necessarily building an enormous metal fence, or as a secondary means, if that is not suitable or is not working, there are other things we can do that people could certainly consider when designing this. Provision of life-saving appliances, and I've got a few images here and we'll talk about. Lifebuoys and Throwlines. There's a recommendations from ourselves as to how many should be installed, how they should be installed. There's a standard for these to make sure the kit is up to spec. This will often be part of our RiverWorks licensing conditions, as we mentioned before. If you get a RiverWorks license from us allowing you to construct or in place something on the Thames, we may well have conditions, and we're likely to have conditions in there that you have permission to build it, but you must also install the safety gear of a certain specification, certain places. And related to that is the maintenance. It's not good enough just to stick up some Lifebuoys and then they quickly, people have too much to drink on a Friday night and think it's a great game to throw them around the place, and then they're all gone. And who checks these things, who replaces them and make sure they're in a fit condition for immediate use? Below that, escape from the river, various design features that could be incorporated to promote people remaining safe if they do enter the river, make it easier for them to be rescued and recovered. And the main ones here are going to be a slope that people can climb up and self-recover themselves, and steps and ladders let them climb free, refuges at the top of those, and the grab chains that are set at different heights for the purpose of allowing people to either stand on them or grip onto them should they be in the water. I just emphasize that these features really should be considered at an early stage when you're planning and not as an afterthought. So that's obviously we do have more information from the PLA of what exactly we want to see in terms of these features if you're going ahead developing and designing an installation. Moving on, lighting and marking of your works and what you've installed. And again, that'll be in consultation with us whenever we go ahead and issue a RiverWorks license. We'll have to consider, is it impinging on the navigable channel, in which case it probably won't be something we'll approve. Is it going to cause a hazard to ships and boats, recreational users and people using the river? And what can or should we do? The PLA has a duty to survey the Thames and to publish those surveys, and we issue our own charts for the use of mariners who are navigating on the river. So we'd make sure that any new installations or works are properly noted on those charts so that mariners are aware of them and could plan their passages appropriately. As you can see there, if you were further down the river, maybe out and towards the estuary where the river is wider, it's deeper, you have larger ships navigating, it might well be the case of implementing buoyage such as that South Cardinal spar buoy there. Upriver, it could be simple as signs and so on, just to mark the extremity of it, especially if it's going to be submerged a lot of the time. but it would still be a hazard to a vessel if we were to hit it underwater. And any lighting installed must not distract from safe navigation. And that's also in the Port of London Act, that we can take action if lights are being displayed, such as to endanger the navigation of vessels on the river. So again, early consultation, discussion with ourselves as to these rather specialized navigational features from the point of view of professional mariners and sailors, and what they will need and expect and how best to communicate it to them. As we hop on, and I believe this is my last slide, so hopefully I'm just on time here. Our other concern would be that whatever you build is not in itself dangerous or hazardous or likely to become so. So it's what I've termed secure by design. What I mean secure, we're looking at, is this likely to come apart, fall apart, break apart, or drift away? We have teams that spend their days out recovering large pieces of timber and trees, old oil drums, and all manner of rubbish that finishes up in the river, needs to be removed, cleaned up, and taken away. Obviously, there is an environmental impact to that. We want to clear up and remove rubbish from the river, but it is a hazard to ships and boats. If you think of a Thames clipper with hundreds of passengers on board doing 25 knots, who strikes a large piece of timber that's floating there, it could do serious damage and injure people on board the boat. So we're keen that these large pieces of timber and so on do not enter the river in the first place. So we are looking at whatever you build or install is not likely to become a hazard to navigation. And should it deteriorate and come apart, so is it properly built and installed to begin with? And that will be part of our review of your design and intentions, and how is it being monitored and maintained to keep it up to the requisite standard. And again, that's something that, again, where necessary, we will have to take action against people who install river works that are not being adequately maintained and which are becoming hazardous. If you're expecting or intending vessels to moor or secure alongside your feature, and it's more than likely you'll be installing a sign saying no mooring, no boats, no access, and so on. But if you were to think it likely that boats would ever moor up or secure alongside, we'd need vertical members or support structures there. Obviously, as the boat goes up and down in the tide, it's going to get caught under a horizontal structure and either could damage the boat or damage your structure. So that would be a particular one, a particular case, if that was what you were intending. And lastly, we need to consider the safe access for maintenance. How is it going to be inspected, maintained, without placing people in any danger, and so on. So that's something, what we're getting at particularly is early consideration to all these points, that when you first start the idea of implementing one of these sites, that these safety and navigation considerations are forefront in your mind whenever you start putting together your plans. And we are available to discuss and consider what you have in mind well in advance to assist you in that process. So that brings me to the end of mine, and I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, David. That was really, really informative. And it's just another reminder that the river is a really complex place, and that you need to keep health and safety in mind. And I really like the secure by design kind of prompt. And for those who have landside developments, will be really familiar with that concept. So it's another early set of thinking and consultation that you need to take on board. Just a reminder to the audience that we have our Q&A running if you haven't been using it. So please ask your questions through the Q&A button, and we're poised to prompt our panelists and have a discussion at the end. So now I'm going to hand over to Rachel Holmes and Morgan Harrington from the EA Sustainable Places team.
Thank you, Heather. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Morgan from the Environment Agency. Myself and my colleague Rachel Holmes are planning advisors, and we're going to be talking about how we achieved excuse me, biodiversity gains through the development planning process, and how we are encouraging Estuary Edges principles to be delivered. Firstly, I'll briefly introduce what the Sustainable Places team do at the Environment Agency. So in general, here's a list of the areas that are within our remit as a statutory consultees. So flood risk, water resources and water quality, land contamination, waste and regulated industry, as well as fisheries, biodiversity and geomorphology. Next slide, please. So what we do at Sustainable Places, well, local planning authorities are required to consult us on certain types of planning applications and on their long-term plans for their borough. At Sustainable Places, we decide who from our technical teams needs to be involved in consultations. We then feed this back to the local planning authorities to provide advice on the environmental issues and opportunities associated with the development proposal. Where there are technical solutions to resolve issues that are preventing planning permission being granted, we should take a yes-if approach and set out the resolutions required to overcome any issues. We also seek to influence local plans, resulting in strong local policies which help enforce appropriate site allocations and planning decisions. Applicants and consultants can approach us for pre-application advice on their development proposals. This would help ensure the soundness of their proposals prior to submission at full application stage. Next slide, please. Sorry, I seem to have a technical issue there. So who do we work with? We work with local planning authorities to ensure applications follow best practice. We provide advice so that the authorities can make sound planning decisions on issues within our remit. Applicants and developers can approach us for pre-application advice to ensure the soundness of their proposed plans. We consult internal technical teams such as Fisheries, Biodiversity, and Geomorphology. Partnership work with organizations such as Natural England, for example, is vital for achieving common environmental objectives. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by national planning, by planning policy in general? We use national, regional, and local planning policy in our responses to planning consultations to reinforce our advice. We are a statutory consultee on planning policy consultations. Planning policy works as a useful guide for developing your designs and proposals. The different tiers of policy filter down through each other. Here are some examples. So the National Planning Policy Framework, paragraph 170 says, planning policies should contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment. This then filters down into the London Plan of March 2016, policy 7.19 that speaks about biodiversity and access to nature. This will then filter down again into the Royal Borough of Greenwich's local plan, dated July 2014. Policy OS4 states Greenwich's rich biodiversity and geodiversity will be protected, restored, and enhanced, including the priority habitats and species identified in the Greenwich Biodiversity Action Plan. Next slide, please. The Thames Estuary 2100 plan promotes a riverside strategy approach. It is a way for those involved in shaping the future of the riverside to deliver the required future changes to the flood defences in a planned and integrated way. The approach seeks to set holistic visions for integrating defence raising and flood protection into placemaking and growth strategies. Along with the Thames Estuary 2100 team, we seek to work with relevant councils to develop riverside strategies. The approach will encourage councils to improve flood risk management in the vicinity of the river, create better access to and along the riverside, and improve the riverside environment in general. Next slide, please. The Charlton Riverside Master Plan, SPD 2017, will involve the creation of 5,000 to 7,500 homes. It mentions that there'll be creative design response to the need for flood protection. The plan also includes guidance on how developers can introduce and improve biodiversity along the river edge. It states in page 118, it will also be possible for developers to vary the line of the flood defense level. Such events could incorporate planting and create habitat which might incorporate into open spaces along the river's edge. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Rachel, who will speak about Flint Glass Wharf in Greenwich.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Morgan said, I'm Rachel and I work as a planning advisor for the same team as Morgan in the Environment Agency. First of all, thank you to Morgan for that introduction on how the Environment Agency interacts with the planning process through its Sustainable Places teams, and for demonstrating how planning policy is kind of aimed at trying to enhance biodiversity along the river corridors, which is in line with kind of the Estuary Edges principles. So now I'm going to look through a recent site that we've been working with other developers to deliver a tidal terracing as part of its redevelopment. So this site is Flint Glass Wharf, which is in Greenwich, and you can see that from this map on the left-hand side. And it's located just upstream of the Thames barrier along the River Thames. It's actually a former go-karting site, and it's being redeveloped by Komodo into a mixed-use scheme with around 500 homes and a new and improved public realm along the riverfront. So you can see from the photographs on the right-hand side that the riverfront is very urban, got lots of concrete, and it's not anywhere near where it could be in terms of its habitat potential. So we were consulted on this site, first of all, by the Royal Borough of Greenwich in September 2018, because we're statutory consultees for development within 20 metres of a main river, as well as for considering other issues such as it being in flood zone 3, being on historic ground contamination sites, and any security and access concerns due to its proximity to the Thames barrier in this specific location. But for the purpose of this webinar, I'll ignore these other constraints and focus on how the Estuary Edges vision is being delivered through this planning application. So the plan on the left-hand side shows the initial site plan, which, as you can see, has got no changes to the river frontage. In terms of biodiversity enhancements, they did propose some minor enhancements such as native species planting and enhancing the foreshore with fish refuge and timber cladding, but not any enhancement at the scale that we would expect to see for a development of this size. So this lack of tidal terracing and biodiversity enhancement is one of the reasons that we recommended that the Royal Borough of Greenwich object to the proposals as submitted. And this was tied really closely into the fact that the flood defences on site were in poor condition and would need considerable remediation to ensure that they were fit for purpose, so they could last the 100-year lifetime of the development, and to make sure that they could be raised in line with the Thames Estuary 2100 plan, as Morgan highlighted earlier. So you can see that creating tidal terracing is closely related to the flood defences. They can't be built riverward of the defences because this would cause encroachment, which is the opposite of what the Estuary Edges guidance is trying to achieve. So instead, the flood defence itself must be moved backwards to create space for the terracing in front. And you can see from the picture on the right-hand side that this is the foreshore looking up at the defences on site. So after our initial objection, we were contacted by the consultant to get some advice on how to overcome this objection. This involved lots of different meetings, reviewing documents and plans and their different designs outside of the statutory planning process. So, of course, they first came to us and they had no tidal terracing, but we had some meetings to discuss what our ambitions would be for the site in terms of ecological enhancement. And then they came back to us with a second proposal, which you can see on the left-hand side. So this included the realignment of the river wall to provide a curved tidal terrace on the west, and then an enhancement of an existing revetment to provide a straight terrace in the east. So again, after this, we had other discussions. We were really pleased that they'd incorporated some terracing, but we thought they could achieve a bit more on the site. So after further discussions and advice, they were able to put forward the third proposal, which is the photograph on the right-hand side. And this includes an additional tidal terrace that was curved, which was achieved through further setbacks of the flood defence. And in addition to this, they also put their surface water outfall so that it drained through the central terrace. And the curved terraces themselves as well are also zigzag terraces with a gentle sloping gradient, which Richard kind of mentioned earlier as a key design criteria. So whilst through the planning process, we can't design the tidal terraces for developers, we are really happy to offer advice and best practice guidance and comments on the designs as they advance to ensure that the best kind of final design can be put forward and for the development. So for example, in this case, we were able to point out a further setback could be achieved to provide additional terraces. We're able to give advice on scour protection, on the height of terraces as well in relation to mean high water needs and mean high water springs, height of the outfall, to make sure that it get the best ecological benefit and ensure that it didn't silt up or impact on flood risk at the same time. And then just in general, further guidance and help with implementing the Estuary Edges guidance as well. So we're really pleased that the designs have been finalised through this process, through working really closely with the consultant and with the council as well. And we're just awaiting formal submission through the statutory planning process to formally remove our objection now that these biodiversity enhancements have been achieved. So that's kind of a brief example of how tidal terracing has been implemented through the planning process. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the key points to take away from that process and how to implement it. So it's important to kind of reiterate some of Dave's earlier points on the importance of partnership working and engaging really early with different organisations involved in the planning process. So as Richard mentioned earlier as well, there's lots of different aspects that feed into the final design of tidal terracing. And these aspects through the planning process are dealt with by lots of different organisations. So for example, the lead local flood authority are responsible for reviewing drainage strategies. The local planning authority and their design team are responsible for commenting on things like building heights and site layouts. And then, of course, the Environment Agency is responsible for advising on the main river biodiversity enhancements and all aspects involving the flood defence works. So it's really important to discuss early on with all these different parties involved to ensure that the best design can be achieved. You don't want to have discussed the whole site layout with the local planning authority or the drainage strategy with the lead local flood authority, only to realise that to achieve the best kind of tidal terracing design, the flood defence needs to be set back and therefore the site layout needs to change, or the drainage outfall needs to be relocated to a different area to benefit the terracing. So it's really important to think about these things and how they all interact really early in the design process. And then feeding into this is kind of coming to all these different organisations for pre-application advice prior to formally submitting an application, hopefully quite early on in the design process before anything's finalised, to make sure that they all work well together. And this includes coming to us, the Environment Agency, for this advice. And we really strongly recommend that you do this because we can review your designs, any supporting documents prior to formally submitting an application and iron out any issues or identify any areas that could be made better prior to starting the statutory process off. And it really helps overcome like any possible delays that could happen from having to go back and forth trying to overcome any objections that we might have at the formal stage. So it's important to note that we do charge for this advice because it is outside of our statutory remit. The consultants and developers found it really beneficial to come to us properly and early on in that stage and get that feedback from us on our design. And we also offer this service between statutory consultations as well, as in the case of the Flint Glass Wharf example, but we recommend coming to us early on before submitting where possible. So my last slide here now is just to kind of quick reminder that as well as planning permission, you may need other consents for your work. So David earlier mentioned the Port of London Authority, river works licenses. You may need an EA receptivity permit for works on the river as well, a marine licence from the Marine Management Organisation, or other environmental permits from the council or the EA, such as waste permits or discharge permits as well. And it's just to reiterate that it's your responsibility to make sure that all the correct permits are obtained for the work, and more information can be found on the Gov.uk website. So I think I've just about managed to stay on time. So that's everything from Morgan and I regarding the planning process and kind of how to implement the Estuary Edges guidance through the planning system. hope you found it useful, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rachel. That was really brilliant. It's so helpful to have someone be able to talk through some of the process and how you're supposed to approach it, because trying to kind of read through some of the guidance cold is very difficult. So this is really, really helpful. And thank you so much to all of our panelists for giving really excellent examples. And we've got, I want to go into a question time now. We are running over a little bit on time, but I'm going to, Amy's helped organize some questions, and then I'll get a 5-minute prompt before we have to close. So I probably won't get to all the questions, and if I don't, we will make sure that we get back to you by email. So first of all, I'm going to start with a question from Al Cree. And if I could put this first to you, Dave.webb, and then maybe Richard, you could follow up. Can allowing self-seeding of sites become a problem if the local area has an abundance of invasive species?
Yeah, so the main issue with the invasive species is going to be primarily the Himalayan balsam. And so the actual part of the estuary where you have the greatest risk is in those freshwater sections. However, the principle of doing some of the terraces is actually to create that gradient, so the different levels within the tidal zone, to enable habitat succession to take place from those very marginal species to full-on terrestrial species. And so by the very fact of how that's been designed, you don't tend to get a single species predominating so much. Probably the one species that does predominate will be things like reed, which can actually tolerate a much wider range of depths. So it certainly is potentially an issue, but to a degree it can be designed out. But if you do think there is going to be a risk, then potentially management would or monitoring would need to take place. However, actually potentially that risk would still be similar if you were to pre-plant it as well.
Thank you, Dave. Richard, do you want to add on to that?
I was talking on mute. Yeah, I was going to say that we on the website we have specifically said try to monitor and manage the site for at least 5 years, and there's a monitoring and maintenance section. So, but because these terraces are often seen, at least within the developer's eyes, as part of the garden and the land around the site, then that usually includes a monitoring and maintenance period anyway. So as Dave said, I think the invasive non-natives should be in patches specific to their elevation, and you should be able to go in and remove them at least for a period of time.
Thank you very much for that. Going on to my next question, I'd like to direct this to Rachel and Morgan. The SuDS example at the Royal Wharf is a good one. Are there plans to promote this approach more widely across riverside development as part of the planning process?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think it's really key to kind of note that our pre-application advice service is kind of a way that we try and get in early with developers to promote those kind of wider aspects of the development. So thinking about not only like the terracing aspect, but kind of the land behind it and how it all integrates. So I think it's partly when developers come to us and we can talk to them early on about those aspects, and also kind of through our wider strategies that we're trying to promote that Morgan mentioned, such as like the riverside strategies and councils trying to kind of develop plans for how they want their riverside to look and how all these aspects can feed into them. I think just on those site-by-site bases and on those kind of more policy documents, we're really trying to kind of promote that, as well as through webinars like this that give across the messages of the Estuary Edges.
Thank you, Rachel. It's great. And Morgan. I've got another 2 questions for you, David Allsop from the PLA. So the first question is, does the PLA promote Estuary Edges sites as a way to exit the river in an emergency? And then I've got another follow-up query. Are estuary edges habitat improvements likely to require an accommodation license?
Yeah, okay. Short answer is no, we don't particularly promote estuary edges sites as a potential means of rescuing or recovering persons from the water, although of course they could be used for that purpose. There are designated casualty landing points around the river, which are used by us, the RNLI lifeboats, the police boat, the fire service boat, and so on for emergency response. So we wouldn't look to recover injured persons across an estuary edges site. But it's not to say it couldn't be done in an emergency situation. The officers on the spot would make the decision if that was the best way of providing medical care to that person or recovering them to safety. As for the safety features, that's fairly common. It doesn't matter if you're implementing an estuary edges site or feature, or you're building a wharf or a jetty, or upgrading a river wall. We will practically always impose a requirement in our licensing regime requiring you to install escape ladders, grab chains, lifebuoys, so on. So the idea of having features to enable persons to escape from the water is fairly standard across the old Thames, where we manage or supervise works and constructions going on. So obviously it's a potential for an estuary edges site might present an easy access, being a slope down without having a lot of access problems. Also have to consider that an estuary edges site might actually be quite attractive to people. They may be intended to walk in it or enjoy it in some way if there's a path through it, depending on its design. So we might be find it more likely that people will have an accident while they're walking there and enter the river, and so we'd be very keen that there is some means of escape for them. So that hopefully that addresses that question. And sure. As far as I'm aware, the idea of an accommodation license is issued by the EA, so that would really only be applicable to the non-tidal Thames above Teddington, which is outside the PLA's jurisdiction. If you were going to build or construct works, including an estuary edges site on the tidal Thames, so below Teddington Lock, you would fall under the PLA's River Works licensing scheme. So obviously, it's not an accommodation license; it's a River Works license, and practically everything that you build or install or construct or in place anywhere below mean high water on the Thames will require a Riverworks license from us, or in some exceptional circumstances an assessment by us that it is outside our Riverworks license scheme, and very little is. Obviously we could consider if it's a very insignificant construction or whatever you're doing, that could be considered by our Riverworks team, whether that needs a full license or a simpler procedure could be followed, but we'd certainly need to be in touch and contact with you and see all your plans if you were building something on the tidal Thames.
Thank you, David. Richard, I see you nodding. Is there anything you'd like to add to that? No, just agree.
No. I was typing to an anonymous attendee who's written a question in one of the chat boxes.
Right. Oh, okay.
I think I was doing that instead.
Well, I've got a question for you then, follow it, Richard. Is how do you see the guidance evolving, and what impact will that have on current sites?
Oh yes, I think that's one. But well, that's probably one for Amy and for Dave as well. But I certainly would like to see further understanding of what's going to happen with sea level rise, especially with the engineered terraces. We rely on a retaining wall at the front, so you can't get continued sediment accretion on top of one of those terraces ad infinitum without slotting in new boards, and you will get coastal squeeze. So the lower terraces will become less vegetated as the mean low water neap level creeps upwards. So understanding how to make them adaptable, I think will be something that's important. Litter, I've already hinted at. We know we're in urban estuaries. I think every time we do a webinar like this, there's always brand new questions, and we always have new branches of investigation. So, but other people will have their own niches of that they feel in terms of how they're not working or how they would like to see them understood better. So I don't think I can answer that question on my own. And in fact, we've got a meeting in a week's time to discuss the website and changes to it. So that will probably there'll be topics discussed then.
Excellent, thank you. Maybe if people have some thoughts, they could email us and let us know what they think, and we can feed that into your thinking.
Absolutely, that would be great.
So I've got a couple more interesting questions. Have we used temporary inclusion of sediment such as rock to help establish habitats lost? Sorry, Richard, this is another one I believe for you. For example, kelps and estuary mouths. Is there a conservation benefit licensing fact tract emerging?
So that's what I was typing to when you thought I was nodding.
Sure.
So I think, so to anonymous attendee who put that question, I think we're keen not to create habitats in estuaries that would have never been there before. I think that's where this question was coming from. So if you're in a habitat that is so badly degraded and changed that it's almost not worth trying to create the lost habitat that's gone from it, then maybe that's the case. And dare I mention, say, the Netherlands, that the coastline there is so, in many places, is so modified that it's worth starting from scratch and looking at rock pools and rocky coasts for your inspiration. The key lost habitats in the Thames is salt marsh and reed bed, and that's what we're trying to create. I know that many developers and our flood risk colleagues who are helping rebuild some of the tidal defences are keen to look at those options. I would tend to reach for a cobble foreshore as the lost habitat rather than going for brand new open rock, which would be more like the open coast. I think that's where that question was coming from. If that question did mean, do we use stone in any way? Yes, the rock rolls that you saw in my presentation is a way of mitigating for higher wave energy that you, or higher currents that you would have may not have 30 years previously. So yes, there is the ability to use some stone of this size to help the natural process of sediment accretion occur.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, well, we're really coming up to the hour, so I'm going to ask one really quick final question to Rachel. If a scheme is permitted development or maintenance, can the EA utilize its own internal policies to ensure net gain is put into place?
I'll mute myself there. I think most development that would be close to the riverside or the flood defence like that is likely to be required planning permission. So obviously we're a statutory consultee on certain types of planning permission. So we do rely on the council consulting us for us to be able to input planning advice. We will use policies such as the national policy, the NPPF that Morgan mentioned, or like the local policies such as in local plans or specific riverside supplementary planning documents to add our advice on getting biodiversity enhancements. So we don't have, the EA doesn't have its own policy as such, but we do have the guidance such as the Estuary Edges guidance that we will promote on those instances as well. So I hope that answers the question, but if something's permitted development then and we're not consulted, then unfortunately we won't be able to put benefits on that site through the planning system. But, most likely if it's a development near the river, we will be consulted.
Thank you, Rachel.
Can I just add to that just quickly?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Currently net gain is still in consultation government regarding how it's going to be implemented. So as of yet, we can't, as a statutory consultancy, we can only provide advice on net gain, on biodiversity net gain. We can't actually condition or object to a site because of a lack of it. We are putting plans in place to do this eventually. So hopefully soon, when the government has progressed with the legislation, we'll be able to ask for more on sites.
Thank you, Morgan. As a reminder that we've sort of running with net gain, but it hasn't actually been put into practice yet. So thank you very much for that. I'm afraid that we're going to have to draw this very interesting discussion to a close. I've had to cut off some questions, but we will approach the panelists with the questions and get back to you. And really, really interesting. The more we unpack this, the more we could just go on with any of the series, asking lots of detailed questions. I hope that the audience found this really helpful. Please do get in touch with us. Eve has sent you links. Richard has pointed out in a chat to me to make sure that go to the Estuary Edges website for the guidance so that you can actually read through the principles. That'd be very helpful. And watch for this video. We will post this on the YouTube as soon as we can. Give us a couple of weeks. And the first webinar, if you want to catch up, is already online. Eve can send you the details. So I'm going to close there and thank everyone very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining, everyone.